are human beings made in the image of God. And, we so often talk about some of the ancient societies and the Aztecs and people who sacrificed children and how horrible and barbaric these people are. Are we any different? Not really.
Dr. Ben Carson, it's great to see you.
Well, wonderful to be here with you. Thank you.
You're a hero in more ways than one, so I'm so excited to get to talk to you. I've never gotten to interview or sit down with you, so this is going to be a big treat for me.
Well, we've been both working vigorously in the pro-life space, so it's about time.
Yes, about time, exactly. So many people know you. You're the very famous, world-renowned neurosurgeon and pediatric neurosurgeon, so you've always been close to the babies. Now you are this incredibly important political and social, cultural figure and leader. But I want to start from the beginning.
Okay.
And you've also written, I think you said 13 books.
Yes.
So you shared some of this in your books, but I wanted to just make sure our audience knew some of your origin story.
I guess my story starts with my mother, who came from a very large rural family in Tennessee, dire poverty, shifted from home to home, never had a stable place to be, didn't finish the third grade, got married at age 13, and moved to Detroit with my father, where he was a factory worker and a part-time preacher. She subsequently discovered he was also a bigamist. And so she was left with the task of trying to raise my brother and myself by herself with less than a third grade education. But the interesting thing about my mother is she would never be a victim. And she would never use an excuse. She never made excuses for herself. And that was a good thing. Problem was she never accepted excuses from us either.
Problem? Looks like you turned out pretty well.
But she was very interested in us succeeding.
Yeah.
And she became a spy because she was a domestic cleaning people's houses. And, they were successful people. So she said, I'm going to figure out why these people are so successful. And she studied them, and she concluded that they didn't watch a lot of TV and they read a lot of books. So she came home and imposed that on my brother and myself. We were quite unhappy about that, but we had to do it. And in the process, I started reading about a lot of successful people, scientists and surgeons and entrepreneurs and explorers. And it dawned on me as I read all those stories that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you is you. It's not somebody else. It's not some circumstance. It's not the environment. And I just stopped listening to all the negativity that was around me. People saying, you can't do this. Society's stacked against you. I just chucked all that stuff in a wastebasket. Started thinking about what I could do and became a voracious reader. I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And just changed my trajectory altogether at that point, and was focused on becoming a physician.
Why a physician? Why as a child did you have that vision that you would be a doctor?
I don't know. I was always interested in medicine, even as a little child. Anything that came on the radio or the television about medicine, I was into it. And the mission stories and church and Sabbath school, they frequently featured missionary doctors and some of the adventures that they went through. And I was just captivated. So I decided when I was 8 years old that I would be a missionary doctor. And, later on, as a teenager, I decided I'd rather be rich. So missionary doctor was out. I decided to become a psychiatrist. But, when I got to medical school, just listening to the neurosurgeons and the stuff that they did, and it was just so fascinating and so incredible. And I started moving in that direction. And then I just always have felt a kinship with children and children's issues. And the thing about children, you can operate on them for 10, 20, 30 hours. And if you're successful, the reward may be 50, 60, 70, 80 years of life.
Wow.
You don't get that with adults.
Oh.
So I like to get a big return on my investment.
And you've gotten those returns.
Gotten great returns on the investment. It's been just such a privilege to intervene in people's lives and give them a second chance or vastly improve the quality of their lives. And one of the greatest joys I get is almost every place I go, I run into either a patient or somebody who knew a patient or a relative of a patient. And they tell me, do you remember? Oh, most of them I do remember. 15,000.
15,000 patients?
Yeah.
You've had 15,000 patients in your career.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And these are many of them children?
The vast majority of them.
Vast majority are kids. Wow.
But I run into people now, obviously adults who have their own children. And sometimes I'll be on an airplane and someone will come up to me and say, I don't remember because I was a little baby, but my parents told me you operated on me. I just want to thank you. I get that a lot.
Wow.
So it's a privilege that God provided by giving me the talent and the skills and the desire to intervene in people's lives like that. And obviously that's one of the reasons that, I feel strongly about preserving babies. I spent my whole career trying to save them. So obviously I'm not going to be too enthusiastic about killing babies.
What was the toughest, one of the toughest cases that you had as a pediatric neurosurgeon and the success that you were able to achieve after operating and treating that patient?
Well, there was a little girl from Connecticut, and she was having intractable seizures. They were just increasing. And, they came to be evaluated for a hemispherectomy. It was a procedure that we had resurrected at Johns Hopkins, had been tried many years earlier and fallen out of favor because of the high morbidity and mortality. And, through direction from God, we figured out some things that would make it a reasonable operation to do. So they came down for evaluation, but when I explained the risk of surgery to the parents, that she might be paralyzed on one side, she might die, she might be in a coma, she might not be able to talk, they said, thanks, but no thanks. Took their little girl back to Connecticut, seizures and all. And that Christmas, she was in a play, and while she was on the stage, she had a grand mal seizure. Fell down, arms and legs jerking, eyes rolled back, foaming at the mouth, incontinent of urine. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. They brought her back. They wanted the surgery. I performed the surgery, took out the left half of her brain. And everything went smoothly, except for one thing. She didn't wake up. She remained in a coma. And a day, 2, 3 days went by. Every time I went in the room, the parents were by the bedside grieving and regretting their decision. And I really felt so badly for them. And a week went by, 2 weeks went by, and she was still in a coma. And she still loved Mr. Rogers, and they would play tapes of Mr. Rogers singing and saying poetry. It didn't wake her up. 3 weeks went by. She was still in a coma. Mr. Rogers heard about her, came all the way to Baltimore with all of his puppets to her bedside to try to wake her up. Didn't wake her up. 4 weeks went by, still in a coma. It was 2 a.m. in the morning, and her dad was laying on a cot next to her hospital bed. And she said, "Daddy, my nose itches."
Wow.
And he was so excited. He jumped up and ran out in the hallway. She talked, only had on his underpants. Everybody came to see what all the commotion was. And there she was, scratching her nose. That was the beginning of her recovery. And in no time, she was walking and talking and not having seizures, and everybody was thrilled. But then it was time for her to go back to school. And now they were worried because she was missing the left half of her brain. That's the side that allows you to calculate, to do math. That says she'll never be able to do math. But she was so determined. The next year, she had the highest math grade in her class with half of her brain. And I tell that story to children all the time, and I say, if she could do that with half a brain, what can you do with a whole brain? There's so much potential, but you just have to cultivate it the right way.
Incredible. What shaped your pro-life conviction?
Well, you know, I grew up in Detroit, a very liberal city, Boston, a very liberal city, New Haven, a very liberal city, Ann Arbor, a very liberal city, Baltimore, a very liberal place. So I was pretty liberal, but I never felt, even with all that liberal background, that killing babies was okay. But I did feel that I didn't have the right to say what anybody else did with their body. So I was pro-choice. And then one day, I was thinking about slavery. And I said, what if the abolitionist had said, I don't believe in slavery, but you do what you want to do? Where would it be? And I recognized that there really was an obligation to do something about it. As I became a pediatric neurosurgeon and spent so much time trying to save innocent little babies and recognizing that these are human beings made in the image of God. And, you know, we so often talk about some of the ancient societies and the Aztecs and people who sacrifice children and how horrible and barbaric these people are. Are we any different? Not really. Killing innocent babies.
What was your first foray into any kind of direct pro-life work? You obviously were doing pro-life work by caring for these little children and doing these incredible surgeries.
I think I burst on the scene when I did some commercials, some pro-life commercials.
This was when you started to get involved in politics.
Yeah, it was before I officially got involved. It was just that I felt strongly that somebody needed to speak out. And it wasn't a popular thing to do at Johns Hopkins, which is a very liberal institution.
So you were still practicing as a neurosurgeon when you started doing pro-life advocacy?
Yes.
How did your colleagues at Johns Hopkins respond?
I had a number of intense discussions.
What does an intense discussion look like with you, Dr. Carson? You're so soft-spoken.
It's true, but you know, I've always tried to be reasonable and to put the facts on the table and say, are you saying that this is not a living individual when it's much more sophisticated than some of the little creatures that you all run around trying to save? Why not try to save this one? You see all the commercials about the dogs and the cats that are being mistreated. And I hate mistreatment of animals. But those same people are okay with killing little babies. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And, you know, I just try to point those things out to people.
Their argument, of course, is that, well, the mother, the good to her, the good to women, the good to her by having an abortion outweighs the harm of destroying this life. Some will even admit, yes, it's ending a life, but the mother has the right to do it for her good if she needs it.
Except they're unwilling to look at the data that shows that so many of those mothers live a life of regret for having done that. And is that really good? And I think it's important to talk about alternatives, creating alternatives for those mothers. It is so difficult to adopt an American baby, and it is very expensive. And there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of young families who want a baby, who would love to have a baby, but we make it so difficult they just give up. I think that's an area that really needs a lot of work. And, we should also be looking at support systems for those mothers who decide to keep their baby. But I think we also need to not back away from talking about abstinence. You're a young girl. You know that having a baby is going to be a real big problem for you. There's a proven way to make sure you don't have a baby. And it's well documented throughout the centuries. What's wrong with that? And, we've been so badgered by the culture that we've gotten to the point where teenagers think there's something wrong with them if they're not having sexual relationships. We need to fight that vigorously with the facts.
I have seen that, and we talk about that at Live Action increasingly now. This really almost an encouragement towards younger people to say, oh, it's not a big deal, sexual exploration's fine, or don't worry about it. And it's healthy to do sexual experimentation as long as there's consent and you practice safe sex. They have all this whole system for to destigmatize sexual activity before marriage. And the reality is 9 out of every 10 women who have an abortion are unmarried.
And you look at the action heroes and people on the television, they're all jumping from bed to bed. And can you imagine young children seeing this and growing up in that environment, what their impressions are going to be? And then you look at the incredibly deleterious effect that pornography has and what that's doing to the young male population. Obviously, these are bad things that are happening to us. And we don't talk about them. And that's the big problem. The other side talks vigorously about what they advocate, and they push it day and night. And the side for morality and decency and family formation quietly sits there and complains in their little groups, but they don't get at that. And I appreciate what you're doing with the videos. Live Action is doing something, and that's good.
What do you think is in your work that you've done as you've been involved now in this fight for, decades, but particularly in the cultural political battle the last decade and a half or so, what have you seen in terms of what you find effective when it comes to persuading people, both younger people and just any person, to be pro-life?
Well, I was talking to a young person yesterday who was pro-choice. And I was describing to them some of the operations that I had to do on premature babies. And the fact that those babies needed anesthesia. They could feel everything.
What age were the babies that you've operated on? What's the youngest
26, 27, 28, 29 weeks gestation.
You've operated on a 26-week-old unborn baby.
Yes. Absolutely.
What did that operation look like?
Usually you're doing something to alleviate fluid accumulations in the brain, things like that. But as you probably know, I've even operated on a set of twins in the mother's uterus. Those babies are active and alive, and they require anesthesia. And the thought of reaching into the uterus with a forceps, grabbing a part of the baby, twisting and pulling, and a baby that can actually feel that. And this young person that I was talking to, I really never thought about that. And it obviously made an impression on me. So much of the activity of people on the other side is born out of lack of knowledge and understanding of what's going on. And of course, as you know, the Planned Parenthood and all these groups, they're not interested in these women knowing what's going on. They certainly don't want you to see the baby on the ultrasound. They don't want you to humanize it in any way. Because they know that when that happens, that attachment, that emotional attachment becomes stronger. And they don't want it to happen.
Can you share more about the development of babies? You mentioned the 26-week-old that you've operated on. Talk a little bit more about what your operations have looked like and what you're attempting or working to heal. And then I would love to hear more about your thoughts on abortion procedures, because like you just said, they are the direct opposite of what you've done throughout your whole career, which is to be a healer. The abortionist is a destroyer.
Yeah, well, you try to get a baby as far along in gestation as possible because the lungs are not well developed. And, when babies are born prematurely and the 25 weeks and more advanced than that, they generally have to be on incubators and various support mechanisms for their lungs until they mature a little bit more. But sometimes they have problems with fluid accumulation. And if the pressure begins to impact the development of the brain, you have to do something about that. So sometimes it's putting in a special device that will allow fluid to flow out of the brain. Sometimes you have to put something internally under the skin that you can insert a needle into through the skin and pull fluid off. Generally, those are the kinds of things. But the actual abortion procedure in the first trimester, the tissues of the baby are not very strong. And so the baby can actually be sucked up through a suction device. And
ripped apart alive.
Basically, you can see on the screen the baby. You can see the arms and the legs and the head. And you can see the tube inserted. And in some cases, it almost seems like the baby's trying to move away from it, but they can't get away. And you actually apply it to a portion of the baby and put the suction on and sucks the baby up. You can see the blood and stuff going down the tube. It's pretty gross. And of course, they never want the woman to see that. So they shield them away from that. But in the second and third trimesters, the tissues are much too well developed to be suctioned. And in those situations, you do a procedure in which you actually pass an instrument into the uterus. You have to dilate the cervix. You pass the instrument into the uterus. You can't actually see what's in there, but you can feel. And you just grab pieces and pull it out. And then once you put the pieces on a table and you sort of put them back together visually to make sure that you've gotten everything. And if you haven't, you have to go back and, curettage and sort of make sure that you've gotten everything out, because if you leave parts in there, that can cause complications.
For those abortions, those D&E abortions, which they're actually taking the piece of the baby out via a forceps that they're ripping and pulling off, are these babies, and these babies could be anywhere from 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 weeks old. Do these babies feel what's happening to them?
The general consensus now is that sensation starts at around 15 weeks of gestation. So obviously they do feel it. And like I said, some of the older babies in their mid to late 20-week gestation stage that we have to operate on, who are born and then are in incubators on full life support, you can't do procedures on them without anesthesia. They feel it and they react to it. So it is really, I don't think people really stop and think about what they're doing. Why would we spend so much time and effort trying to save snail darters that are considerably less complex than that baby? It just doesn't make any sense. If you're driven and motivated by compassion for living things, why would you not be driven by compassion for a living human being?
There's a lot of people, Dr. Carson, who think that if the baby's really sick, if the baby has a disability like hydrocephaly, or they have some sort of condition of development where the brain hasn't fully developed, or they're missing a body part, or they have this chromosomal genetic condition. And so the baby will suffer. If the baby's born, the baby will suffer. The baby will die during birth. So they say it's more compassionate to kill the baby before birth. That's more compassionate. I was on the Dr. Phil show, and I was there talking to this woman that they brought on the show who had had an abortion on a late-term baby who would have, they said, been carried to bury. She would have died at birth or during birth. And so how could you not allow this poor woman to have an abortion? What are your thoughts on that?
But there are so many stories where people said that the baby was going to be in severe condition, and it turned out that that was not the case. So you don't totally know. And if the baby, has anencephaly or something of that nature, it is true that they will die. But because something or someone is going to die, does that give you right to kill them? We're all going to die. So maybe carry that argument to its logical extension. Well, since you're going to die anyway, why not get rid of you now? That doesn't make any sense.
It's the argument for quality of life, right? Well, yeah, we'll die, but hopefully we'll have a long life in front of us. But if the conditions are so crippling and there's not good quality of life or potential longevity of life, then therefore it should be okay to kill.
I would say tell that to many of the families who have a child who was born with a disability, Down syndrome or something. See how much they love that child, how much that child is a part of their family. And ask them, would they be okay with that child being killed? I don't think so. But really, it comes down to a matter of, do you respect life? Is life important to you? When it comes down to an argument about quality of life, you get into some real gray areas. If you go back and you read about Nazism and how the Holocaust started, it started with quality of life issues. And these people, we are actually doing them a favor if we get rid of them, And, the scale keeps changing, and you march further up the ladder in terms of the quality of life. And pretty soon it's, these miserable people, they think this way. They must be miserable. Let's put them out of their misery. It's the way the radical Islamics think about infidels. So we certainly need to reach a point in our society where we respect all life and we deal with it as necessary in terms of keeping people comfortable. And yes, I agree, some of them are going to die, but that doesn't mean that we should be the mechanism of their death.
Why? Why should we not be the mechanism of someone else's death? It seems silly we have to ask this question, but it's one of the most important questions today.
Because it's a slippery slope. when you start defining whose and what quality of life warrants maintenance of life and what does not. And that's very subjective.
Dr. Carson, you had this very, very, very successful career. You're highly awarded, highly acclaimed as this pediatric neurosurgeon. You had 16,000 patients, you said earlier. It's just incredible. You retire from Johns Hopkins, and then you enter U.S. politics, and everyone tells you to run for president. How did that all happen? Because my understanding is that was not in the cards when you were retiring, that you would be taking on this new mission.
I had predetermined when I was going to retire. Someone told me that neurosurgeons die early, and I didn't believe it, so I wrote down the name of the last 10 that I knew who died, calculated the average age of death, and it was 61. So
why were they all dying so young, neurosurgeons?
Most of them had heart attacks.
Stress,
yeah. And it is stressful. I didn't think it was stressful while I was doing it. But when I retired, I realized that it was stressful. I said, no one's life is at stake. You know, what's going on here?
Wow.
But, you know, when I decided I would retire at 61 and become a really good golfer, and learn how to play the organ. And I had it all planned out. And then I was asked to give the presidential prayer breakfast keynote address in 2013.
So Obama asked you, did he know what he was getting himself into?
Well, the president isn't the one who actually makes the invitation.
That's right. But they can veto, though.
Yeah. I can.
So the fact that you were a speaker, that's pretty remarkable.
Well, you know, I was very surprised to get the invitation because I had given the presidential prayer breakfast keynote in 1997 when Clinton was president. And I wasn't aware that anyone ever did it twice. I did some research and found out that there was one person who had done it twice, and that was Billy Graham. And I said, wow, that's pretty good company. So I agreed to do it, but I didn't know what I was going to say until the day of the speech.
Really?
Yeah.
Was that intentional, or you?
I just didn't know. They kept saying, "What are you going to say? We have to tell President Obama so he can respond." And I said, I don't know. I'll let you know as soon as I know. But I didn't know.
Did you have any ideas going into it?
I had some thoughts, but
is that typically how you operate, impromptu? You don't like to do that kind of... It's funny to hear this from a neurosurgeon who spent your whole life preparing for a career in medicine, that you don't like to prepare for your speeches.
Well, I hate people who read speeches. I just find that so boring. And a lot of times I will have notes, things that I hope to say. Frequently, I don't say any of those things, and I say a bunch of different things. But I always ask the Lord for guidance. And after that speech, everybody was clamoring, you should run for president. I said, these people are crazy. I said, why would I do something like that? And I said, if I just ignore them, it'll go away. But everywhere I went, there were people with placards, run, Ben, run. I had over 500,000 petitions in my office. It was absolutely insane. And I finally just said, Lord, if you really want me to do this, you have to give me all the things that a person who runs for president has. A Rolodex with all the important names, a lot of money, and an organization. And I said, I'm not going to develop those things, so you'll have to provide them. The next thing I knew, they were all there. And our organization was raising more money in a month than RNC.
Wow.
It was pretty amazing. But it was fascinating because as I traveled around, I went to all 50 states, the smallest little hamlets in North Dakota and Alabama to the largest cities. And I was very impressed by the fact that most Americans have common sense. But I was distressed by the fact that most people don't have courage. And that is the major problem with our society. A lot of people think the right way, but they're afraid. They're afraid to speak up because the media and several entities will try to cancel them or call them nasty names or hurt their family. And people have to realize that you cannot remain the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave. If you're not willing to stand up for what you believe in, you're going to lose it. And that's what Ronald Reagan was talking about when he said our freedom is never more than one generation away. And I think a lot of people can see that now. And some of that revolves around the fact that we're losing our respect for life from the cradle to the grave. And when we lose our respect for life, we lose our respect for each other. And hence you see the massive divisions that are occurring within our society now. And that's the only way to bring down a nation as strong as ours. You'll never bring them down militarily, but you can destroy them from within. And you destroy the respect for life and respect for family and family traditions and God. And all of a sudden, you've got total chaos. And that's what we're seeing right now. Doesn't mean that we should throw our hands up. It means we should fight vigorously. Recognize that there were those who came before us who fought vigorously, which is why we have the freedoms that we have now. And we have to fight particularly for the innocent, for those who cannot defend themselves. Now, the Bible says in Proverbs 24:11 and 12, what about the innocent ones who are being drawn into death? Did you say anything? Did you do anything? So we are expected to do something.
Would you say that in the last decade or so, things have gotten better, or are they getting worse?
I would say things have gotten much worse.
Both culturally and politically?
Yes.
Why do you think that is, despite our best efforts?
I think because there are those who have been working very hard for a long time to fundamentally change our society. They don't believe in the way that we do things. This has been going on for a very long time. If you go back and look at the congressional record, January the 10th, 1963, Congressman Herlong of Florida read in the 45 Goals of Communism in America. It included things like denigrating the status of the American family, driving wedges between parents and children, gaining control of the media so that you can indoctrinate and manipulate thinking of the people. And, you know, it sort of was under the surface for decades. But then along came an administration that allowed it to bubble up to the surface. And so a lot of people think this has only been going on for the last few years, but it's been going on for a much longer period of time than that.
So would you say that because of the work that you could argue Marxism or communism, you know, those that held those ideologies put in decades and decades ago, and capturing institutions, you know, capturing so much of media and entertainment, like you spoke about, the school system, capturing a lot of the school system, capturing at least a whole political party on the left, but I would say argue there's aspects of it that bubble up on the right. And, you know, now we're seeing just this chaos culturally, breakdown of families, of course, the abortion rate, you see gender ideology confusing a whole generation of kids, and record mental illness,
Right.
a record suicide. I mean, it's devastating. How do you see our response? What should good people of conscience be doing? Mm-hmm. And this is a huge question, of course, so take your time answering, but how do we take back the institutions that have been hijacked?
Well, you know, historically, our nation has had 4 revivals. They've usually been around the times of war or pestilence. We've had both of those. And now would be a very good time for us to return to our faith roots and, recognize that our Judeo-Christian values teach us to love your neighbor, not to hate your neighbor if they have a different yard sign. And freedom that was fought for. We need to honor the people who fought for our freedom by not allowing it to recede. And the sense of community. In this nation, when we began, we had people from all different countries. And you would find many communities, maybe 100 families. Some of them couldn't speak to each other because they came from different countries, but they understood the concept of the common good. And, if it was harvest time and Mr. Johnson broke his leg, everybody else harvested his crops. They didn't ask him what his religion was or what his politics were. All they knew was that he was their neighbor and he needed help. It was that sense of community that led to the incredible strength that our country had. We've thrown that out. And then we did respect, like we had respect for life from the womb to the tomb. And it made a difference in the way that we treated each other. All of those things need to be addressed. And we once again need to talk about it. You're told from the time that you're a little child, there are two things you should never talk about in public: religion and politics. Those are the exact things we need to be talking about. Those are the things that are being radically affected, and that's destroying our country.
What does this look like for institutions? Like we have a nonprofit, Live Action, and we're working every day using media. A lot of it's for younger people. We also work with lawmakers and people of influence to get them in the position where they can be boldly pro-life and speak the truth persuasively and implement policies and programs that are going to help people. So we're working that angle. In the individual level, people, we're saying, have strong families, strong marriages, marry well, raise your kids well, be honest, work hard. What else? What else can we do?
Well, I think we have to push those things publicly. And when somebody, for instance, is a legislator and they come out and voice those kinds of opinions, we have to get behind them. We have to let them know that there is a strong force behind them. Otherwise, they will cower and go sit in the corner and be quiet like everybody else. But like I said earlier, there are a lot of good people, logical people, thinking people, but they're afraid. And they would be less afraid if they knew there were other people behind them. With your voices, with their finances, with a whole host of things. Get behind these people and push them. Because we live in a republic. That means it's a representative, and our representatives have to be courageous. And when Benjamin Franklin was asked, what do we have here, sir? A monarchy or a republic? He said, a republic if you can keep it. If you can keep it. Whether or not we can keep it depends on we the people and how courageous we are, and the recognition of the fact that we have something that is magnificent. There's an American dream. There's no dream for any other country. This is a very special place. Are we willing to throw that away so we can be like everybody else? Or is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Dr. Carson, do you think the next 10 years we're going to see things get worse before they get better? Or do you think we're at a low point, and so there's got to be mass revival, conversion? People are just knowing it's not working.
Well, they say it's always darkest before the dawn. Sometimes it has to be pretty dark before people see the light. I think a lot of people are starting to see the light now. I think we're getting close to the bottom. It may go a little bit more, but I think enough people know that we're on the brink of losing everything that makes America great. And I think you're going to see that manifested very soon.
Recently, the RNC changed their platform. You were one of the only, I mean, it was remarkable how many people just, I hear no evil, see no evil. They acted like nothing had happened. This is the Republican National Convention voting on the platform that for decades, it had been 4 decades of a strong pro-life platform, and then they changed it. And people say that it was under pressure from the Trump campaign, and they put in, they basically are promoting birth control now, IVF, which leads to 1 million frozen embryos, all of these babies, very high risk for the babies. They weakened the platform to make abortion up to the states, like let the states decide whether the babies live or die. And then they also weakened the language about marriage being between one man and one woman. You spoke out against that. I thought was so happy to see that because, again, so few people even said a peep about it because they didn't want to get involved in, disrupting things for the Republicans if that's where their loyalty lay. What did you say? Why did you say it?
Well, basically, my message is that we are not enemies. W-A-N-E, Wayne. We've let hatred and division reign for a long time. It's time to let it wane. But when it comes to pro-life issues, there are some people who believe that life begins at conception. Some think at 6 weeks when the heart beats. Some think at 15 weeks when you can feel things. But what I say is they're all under the pro-life umbrella. They're at different stages as we move toward a society that respects life. So we have to stop fighting each other, recognize that we have a goal of having a society that appreciates life and respects life and preserves life. But let's not fight each other on the way there. And I obviously initially felt that national legislation would probably be a good thing, prohibiting abortion. But I also recognize that doing that would create enormous chaos. And that what we have to concentrate on is converting rather than coercing. Converting people and helping them to understand what life is and what our obligations are. Because if you try to force people, you will never be successful. And you will just create chaos. We have to be patient, recognizing that we are making progress. We're going to continue to make progress. And we cannot ever be in the place where we decide that we're going to legislate morality.
But isn't that most of our law today? Do not murder, do not rape. So much of our law is about morality. These things are wrong, and so we're going to force people not to do this thing. Or, you can't force someone to not kill. I mean, they could still go out and murder, but then there's a penalty. There's a consequence for that, and society says this is a bad thing, so we're going to have consequences for it. And you mentioned the national legislation, and I understand how controversial it has become. In another era, it'd be like, of course, it shouldn't be okay to kill babies, duh, But now it's so controversial, and unfortunately, the right is, many on the right are watering down their platform, their statements. But I look at it and I say, listen, what if we had held that view about slavery? Or about Jim Crow, saying, well, the people want it. They want slavery. Enough people want it. Enough people want Jim Crow. We can't force them to not have it. Where would we be?
Well, I think, again, what we have to do is put the facts on the table and talk about these things rather than just say, my way or the highway. It's very hard to have a society that is multifaceted with many different views and to have a my way or the highway approach. It never works. It never has worked anywhere. It won't work here. And what we have to be conscious of is the fact that historically, America is a reactive nation. We're not like China, where we have long-term plans and goals and ways to get there. We are people who react every 4 years to what's going on. And as a result of that, we lurch to the right and then we lurch to the left. We never make forward progress. We have to think logically. We want to make sure that there's going to be a big reaction, there's no question about it, to this leftward plunge that we've taken. And it's going to be a big reaction to the right. And what we're going to have to be wary of is, are we going to let it go so far that we say, you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to go to church this day, and you have to do this. And, it's a real issue. We have to have strong arguments, and we have to put the facts on the table, and we have to be willing to talk about them and defend them. And we can't just say, I'm sorry, but you got to do this, because it's not going to work. And it won't do you any good if you don't have power. And you won't have power if you're not clever. The Bible says, be wise as serpents, but humble as doves. And you have to know how to play that game. You have to understand it. Or you'll never have any power, and you'll never get to do anything, and you'll never get to save anybody.
Do you think that there is a certain point that many politicians will face, and have you faced it, where there's an opportunity for power, but it requires not a compromise on policy, because policy compromises have to happen all the time, but a compromise on principles?
Well, I always say I'm willing to compromise on methods, but not on principles. That's what compromise, in my opinion, is about. Figuring out, what do you want and what do I want? And what do we have in common? And where can we get to a point where we can coexist peacefully? So, but that does not include compromising principles, only methods. But if we're willing to compromise on methods, we can make a lot of progress. You take something like green energy. You have a group of people who say, no fossil fuels, that's destroying our environment. We can't do that. We can only have green energy. And others who say, we have an abundance of fossil fuels and they'll last us for decades or centuries. And we don't need to be worried about all this other stuff, which is just trying to control people. Well, what's wrong with using both? And what's wrong with using one to get to the other? But you can't do that if you're not willing to sit down and talk about methods as opposed to ideology.
Last question for you, Dr. Carson. This has been great. What is next for you?
I still like to play golf and learn how to play the organ.
Are you learning?
No.
No.
I've concluded that I'm probably never going to get to do that in this life. But there's another life. I'll retire when I get to heaven. There's just too much to do right now. And,
Are you going to run again in the future?
it's not my plan. I will always do what the Lord wants me to do. But that can be done from inside or outside of government. And, right now, it's such a serious situation in our country on so many levels. And I'm going to continue to stay very much involved with trying to help our legislators, our judicial people, and most importantly, the American populace to think through these issues. and to recognize that we're not each other's enemies. We have to understand that. If we don't understand that, we will never succeed.
Thank you, Dr. Carson.
Okay. Thank you for what you did.
Me too.